Hello, welcome back. I'm reading I say we're, but The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald. It's a free book. We're on chapter 19 right now. You can start here or start at the beginning. It doesn't matter. In the long run, it doesn't matter because, I was just contemplating here before I started. I'm not reading these books just for fun. It's beautiful. It's so beautiful and transformative. But sometimes the mystics, I just read a quote by Evelyn Underhill about how the mystics were here to speak the words of the divine and bring them into ordinary life. And sometimes we can't find the words, or they're not enough because we have just this deep love for people and for you to understand on a deep level. I know some of that's from my childhood, just when you feel like you got stepped on from people that didn't understand, you have a high calling to protect other children from those types of people and from taking that in and from believing that, I forgot, I'm making this for kids, so I won't go super deep into that, but, you want to teach yourself how to not be like that and how to be wise and how to be truly good. Not just follow a set of rules, but be truly good. And so C.S. Lewis, who was one of Tolkien's best friends, who came back to his faith because of Tolkien, the guy that wrote The Lord of the Rings, in part because of Tolkien, of course, the divine God calls us, each of us. But Lewis said that he considers George MacDonald, the author of this Scottish man, his master, and that he quoted him either directly or indirectly in every one of his works, the fiction and the nonfiction. And I see it all the time because I read George MacDonald and Madeleine L'Engle, the writer of A Wrinkle in Time and Many Waters and those books, said that the best thing that Lewis brought her was introducing her to C.S. Lewis brought to her was to bring her to George MacDonald. I took a writing course with her. Anyway, I'm a psychologist in my day job. I'm reading this because sometimes we keep trying to follow the rules and we follow just ideas stuck in our head, and you need to see things in story form because we're living out a story ourselves. And so when we see it in story form, it informs our story and wakes things up in us that are meant to be woken up a long, long time ago, but we get the opportunity for them to be woken up right now. And so I'm going to just read this right now, and I'm going to turn the camera for a little while towards the ocean. The ocean's right in front of me right there. So I'll show you that. And I just realized I didn't put my mic on. So I'll get that. Sometimes I think it's better without. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There we go. All right. Enjoy that. Get really present. Become really present to this moment. That's another thing that story does. This is why I love roller skating so much too. If you're roller skating or snowboarding or doing art or rock climbing, you have to be very, very present, or else, you mess up the whole canvas, let's say, or you fall or whatever. And so it's very contemplative. So enter into the story and you're being present because you don't know what's going to happen next. Even though I've read this before, I forget what's going to happen next. And so I'm present here with you. And share this and like and comment so that this channel can grow and other people can get this. Because I haven't spent my time figuring out how to do the algorithms. So I'm just depending on you guys to do it or something until another option comes up for me or some other way. I don't mind doing the study, but anyway, okay. Chapter 19, The King's Chamber. He found himself in a large room. This is Curdie, right? Lighted by a silver lamp that hung from the ceiling. Far at the other end was a great bed surrounded with dark, heavy curtains. He went softly towards it, his heart beating fast. It was a dreadful thing to be alone in the king's chamber at the dead of the night. To gain courage, he had to remind himself of the beautiful princess who had sent him, the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of the princess, the daughter of this king. The grandmother of this king, you'll see, you'll know her more. But when he was about halfway to the bed, a figure appeared from the farther side of it and came towards him with a hand raised warningly. He stood still. The light was dim, and he could distinguish little more than the outline of a young girl. But though the form he saw was much taller than the princess he remembered, he never doubted it was she. For one thing, he knew that most girls would have been frightened to see him there in the dead of the night. But like a true princess, and the princess he used to know, she walked straight on to meet him. And as she came, she lowered the hand she had lifted and laid the forefinger of it upon her lips. Nearer and nearer, quite near, close up to him, she came and then stopped and stood a moment looking at him. "You are Curdie," she said. "And you are the Princess Irene," he returned. "Then we know each other still," she said, with a sad smile of pleasure. "You will help me?" "That I will," answered Curdie. I could cry for about a day after just reading what I just read, but I won't keep commenting right now. He did not say, "if I can," for he knew that he was sent to do that he could do. "May I kiss your hand, little princess?" She was only between 9 and 10, though indeed she looked several years older, and her eyes almost those of a grown woman, for she had had terrible trouble of late. She held out her hand. "I am not the little princess any more. I have grown up since I last saw you, Mr. Miner." He was a miner before, with his parents, his dad. Anyway, the smile which accompanied the words had in it a strange mixture of playfulness and sadness. "So I see, Miss Princess," returned Curdie, "and therefore, being more of a princess, you are the more my princess. Here I am, sent by your great-great-grandmother to be your servant. May I ask why you are up so late, princess?" "Because my father wakes so frightened, and I don't know what he would do if he didn't find me by his bedside. There, he's waking now." She darted off to the side of the bed she had come from. Curdie stood where he was. A voice altogether unlike what he remembered of the mighty noble king on his white horse came from the bed, thin, feeble, hollow, and husky, and in tone like that of a petulant child. "I will not. I will not. I am a king, and I will be a king. I hate you and despise you, and you shall not torture me." "Never mind them, father dear," said the princess. "I am here, and they shan't touch you. They dare not, so long as you defy them." "They want my crown, darling, and I can't give them my crown, can I? For what is a king without his crown?" "They shall never have your crown, my king," said Irene. "Here it is, all safe, you see. I am watching it for you." Curdie drew near the bed on the other side. There lay the grand old king. He looked grand still, and 20 years older. His body was pillowed high, his beard descended long and white over the crimson coverlid, and his crown, its diamonds and emeralds gleaming in the twilight of the curtains, lay in front of him, his long, thin, old hands folded round the regole, and the ends of his beard straying among the lovely stones. His face was like that of a man who had died fighting nobly, but one thing made it dreadful: his eyes, while they moved about, as if searching in this direction and in that, looked more dead than his face. He saw neither his daughter nor his crown. It was the voice of the one and the touch of the other that comforted him. He kept murmuring what seemed words, but was unintelligible to Curdie, although to judge from the look of Irene's face, she learned and concluded from it. By degrees his voice sank away, and the murmuring ceased, although still his lips moved. Thus lay the old king on his bed, slumbering with his crown between his hands, On one side of him stood a lovely little maiden with blue eyes and brown hair going a little back from her temples, as if blown by a wind that no one felt but herself, and on the other a stalwart young miner with his mattock over his shoulder. Stranger sight still was Lena, lying along the threshold, only nobody saw her just then. A moment more, and the king's lips ceased to move. His breathing had grown regular and quiet. The princess gave a sigh of relief and came round to Curdie. "We can talk a little now," she said, leading him towards the middle of the room. "My father will sleep now till the doctor wakes him to give him his medicine. It is not really medicine, though, but wine. Nothing but that, the doctor says, could have kept him so long alive. He always comes in the middle of the night to give it to him with his own hands, but it makes me cry to see him waked up when so nicely asleep." "What sort of man is your doctor?" asked Curdie. "Oh, such a dear, good, kind gentleman," replied the princess. "He speaks so softly and is so sorry for his dear king. He will be here presently, and you shall see for yourself. You will like him very much." "Has your king father been long ill?" asked Curdie. "A whole year now," she replied. "Did you not know? That's how your mother never got the red petticoat my father promised her. The Lord Chancellor told me that not only Gwentystorm but the whole land was mourning over the illness of the good man." Now Curdie himself had not heard a word of His Majesty's illness, and had no ground for believing that a single soul in any place he had visited on his journey had heard of it. Moreover, although mention had been made of His Majesty again and again in his hearing since he came to Gwentystorm, never once had he heard an allusion to the state of his health, and now it dawned upon him also that he had never heard the least expression of love to him. But just for the time he thought it better to say nothing on either point. "Does the king wander like this every night?" he asked. "Every night," answered Irene, shaking her head mournfully. "That is why I never go to bed at night. He is better during the day a little, and then I sleep in the dressing room there, to be with him in a moment if he should call me. It is so sad. He should have only me, and not my mamma. A princess is nothing to a queen." Their mom has passed on in this story. "I wish he would like me," said Curdie, "for then I might watch him at night and let you go to bed, princess." "Don't you know, then?" returned Irene in wonder. "How was it you came? Ah, you said my grandmother sent you, but I thought you knew that he wanted you." And again she opened wide her blue stars of her eyes, Her blue stars. "Not I," said Curdie, also bewildered, but very glad. "He used to be constantly saying he was not so ill then as he is now, that he wished he had you about him." "And I never to know it," said Curdie with displeasure. "The master of the horse told Papa's own secretary that he had written to the minor general to find you and send you up. But the minor general wrote back to the master of the horse, and he told the secretary, and the secretary told my father that they had searched every mine in the kingdom and could hear nothing of you. My father gave a great sigh and said he feared the goblins had got you after all, and your father and mother were dead of grief." That was the fears of the king after he was given these messages. "And he has never mentioned you since, except when wandering, like he wanders here at night. I cried very much, but one of my grandmother's pigeons with its white wing flashed a message to me through the window one day, and then I knew that my Curdie wasn't eaten by the goblins, for my grandmother wouldn't have taken care of him one time to let him be eaten the next. Where were you, Curdie, that they couldn't find you?" You remember if you go back to the beginning of the story, Curdie had forgotten and was going his own way and came back. But you can read about it. I won't go on. "We will talk about that another time when we're not expecting the doctor," said Curdie. As he spoke, his eyes fell upon something shining on the table under the lamp. His heart gave a great throb. And he went nearer. Yes, there could be no doubt. It was the same flagon that the butler had filled in the wine cellar. It looked worse and worse, because remember, Curdie has this gift that his grandmother gave him, that he can feel the hand of people and see which direction they're going, if they're going towards a human hand or towards an animal hand. And the wine cellar person had a pig's hoof, if I remember. I can't remember for sure, but anyway. He's saying, it looks worse and worse, he said to himself, and went back to Irene, where she stood half dreaming. When will the doctor be here? He asked once more, this time hurriedly. The question was answered not by the princess, but by something which that instant tumbled heavily into the room. Curdie flew towards it in a vague terror about Lena. On the floor lay a little round man, puffing and blowing and uttering incoherent language. Curdie thought of his mattock and ran and laid it aside. "Oh, dear Dr. Kelman," cried the princess, running up and taking hold of his arm. "I am so sorry." She pulled and pulled, but might almost as well have tried to set up a cannonball. "I hope you have not hurt yourself." Not at all," said the doctor, trying to smile and rise both at once, but finding it impossible to do either. If he slept on the floor, he would be late for breakfast, said Curdie to himself, and held out his hand to help him. But when he took hold of it, Curdie very nearly let him fall again, for what he held was not even a foot. It was the belly of a creeping thing. He managed, however, to hold both his peace and his grasp, and pulled the doctor roughly on his legs, such as they were. So he could feel who he was becoming. Sometimes you're not meant to say something, sometimes you are. Here's the picture in the book. The book is free domain. Oh, that's the princess pulling him up at first. And Curdie is after that, On Project Gutenberg. I ought to have it in the link in my description on YouTube. Your Royal Highness has rather a thick mat at the door, said the doctor, putting his palms together. I hope my awkwardness may not have startled His Majesty. While he talked, Curdie went to the door. Lena was not there. The doctor approached the bed. And how has my beloved king slept tonight? He asked. No better, answered Irene, with a mournful shake of her head. Ah, that is very well, returned the doctor, his fall seeming to have muddled either his words or his meaning. We must give him his wine, and then he will be better still. Curdie darted at the flagon and lifted it high as if he had expected to find it full, but had found it empty. That stupid butler, I heard them say, he was drunk, he cried in a loud whisper, and was gliding from the room. Come here with that flagon, you, page, cried the doctor. Curdie came a few steps towards him with the flagon dangling from his hand, heedless of the gushes that fell noiseless on the thick carpet. Are you aware, young man, said the doctor, that it is not every wine can do His Majesty the benefit I intend he should derive from my prescription? Quite aware, sir, answered Curdie. The wine for His Majesty's use is in the third cask from the corner. Fly, then, said the doctor, looking satisfied. Curdie was the one that answered. The wine for His Majesty's use is in the third cask from the corner. Fly, then, said the doctor, looking satisfied. Curdie stepped outside the curtain and blew an audible breath. No more. Up came Lima, noiseless as a shadow. He showed her the flagon. The cellar, Lena, go, he said. She galloped away on her soft feet. And Curdie had indeed to fly to keep up with her. Not once did she make even a dubious turn. From the king's gorgeous chamber to the cold cellar they shot. Curdie dashed the wine down the back stair, wrenched the flagon out, as he had seen the butler do, filled it from the cask of which he had seen the butler drink, and hastened with it up again to the king's room. He filled it up with the right stuff, you'll see. The little doctor took it, poured out a full glass, smelt it but didn't taste it, and sat down. He then leaned over the bed, shouted in the king's ear, blew upon his eyes, and pinched his arm. Curdie thought he saw him run something. Okay, look, here's a beautiful picture of the king and the princess. And then the, quote, doctor. he saw him run something bright into it. At last the king half woke. The doctor seized the glass, raised his head, poured the wine down his throat, and let his head fall back on the pillow again, tenderly wiping his beard and bidding the princess good night in paternal tones. He then took his leave. Curdie would gladly have driven his pick into his head, but that was not in his commission, and he let him go. The little round man looked very carefully to his feet as he crossed the threshold. That attentive fellow of a page has removed the mat, he said to himself as he walked along the corridor. I must remember him. Chapter 20. Counter-plotting. All right. Curdie was already sufficiently enlightened as to how things were going to see that he must have the princess of one mind with him, and they must work together. It was clear that amongst those about the king there was a plot against him. For one thing, they had agreed in a lie concerning himself, concerning the Curdie, because they had said that they looked for him everywhere. And it was plain also that the doctor was working out a design against the health and reason of his majesty, rendering the question of his life a matter of little moment. It was in itself sufficient to justify the worst fears that the people outside the palace were ignorant of his majesty's condition. He believed those inside it also, the butler excepted, were ignorant of it as well. Doubtless his majesty's counsellors desired to alienate the hearts of his subjects from their sovereign. Curdie's idea was that they intended to kill the king, marry the princess to one of themselves, and found a new dynasty. But whatever their purpose, there was treason in the palace of the worst sort. They were making and keeping the king incapable in order to effect that purpose. The first thing to be seen to, therefore, was that his majesty should neither eat morsel nor drink drop of anything prepared for him in the palace. Could this have been managed without the princess? Curdie would have preferred leaving her in ignorance of the horrors from which he sought to deliver her. He feared also the danger of her knowledge betraying itself to the evil eyes about her, but it must be risked. She had always been a wise child, very wise. She saved him by following her grandmother's quote invisible thread, found him in the mines. You can read that. I read it. I did read it. I have it online. It's on my channel in a playlist, The Princess and the Goblin. This is The Princess and the Curdie. So go listen to that as you wait for more of these videos to be let out. But I'm reading these pretty fast because I keep wanting to read this story. All right. So she'd always been a wise child. Another thing was clear to him, that with such traitors, no terms of honor were either binding or possible, and that short of lying, he might use any means to foil them. Not lying, but, they were traitors, so he's not meant to honor them. Honor them as souls and bodies. But anyway, that's George MacDonald taught me that. Don't teach your children they have souls. Teach them they are souls, and they have a body. They're in a body, He might use any means to foil them, and he could, short of lying, he might use any means to foil them, and he could not doubt that the old princess had sent him expressly to frustrate their plans. While he stood thinking thus with himself, the princess was earnestly watching the king with looks of childish love and womanly tenderness that went to Curdie's heart. Now and then, with a great fan of peacock feathers, she would fan him very softly. Now and then, seeing a cloud begin to gather upon the sky of his sleeping face, she would climb upon the bed, and bending to his ear, whisper into it, and then draw back and watch again, generally, to see the cloud disperse. Look at this picture. If you're listening, then it's just her with the peacock feather. In his deepest slumber, the soul of the king lay open to the voice of his child, and that voice had power either to change the aspect of his visions, or, which was better still, to breathe hope into his heart and courage to endure them. Curdie came near and softly called her. I can't leave Papa just yet, she returned in a low voice. I will wait, said Curdie, but I want very much to say something. In a few minutes she came to him where he stood under the lamp. Well, Curdie, what is it? She said. Princess, he replied. I want to tell you that I have found why your grandmother sent me. All right, I'm going to turn you guys back to the vast ocean. We have the whole horizon. There. Come this way then, she answered, where I can see the face of my king. Curdie placed a chair for her in the spot she chose, where she would be near enough to mark any slightest change on her father's countenance, yet where their low-voiced talk would not disturb him. There he sat down beside her and told her all the story, how her grandmother had sent her good pigeon for him, and how she had instructed him and sent him there without telling him what he had to do. Then he told her what he had discovered of the state of things generally in Gwentystorm, and especially what he had heard and seen in the palace that night. Things are in a bad state enough, he said in conclusion, lying and selfishness and inhospitality and dishonesty everywhere. And to crown all, they speak with disrespect of the good king, and not a man of them knows he is ill. You frighten me dreadfully, said Irene, trembling. You must be brave for your king's sake, said Curdie. In the first book, George MacDonald reminds us that we are all sons and daughters of the great king, so we are all princes and princesses. So this is a call to bravery for all of us in each of our tasks at hand. It's in Psalm 27, be of good courage, which is like God courage, and he will strengthen your heart. You must be brave for your king's sake, said Curdie. Indeed, I will, she replied, and turned a long, loving look upon the beautiful face of her father. But what is to be done? And how am I to believe such horrible things of Dr. Kelman? My dear princess, replied Curdie, you know nothing of him but his face and his tongue, and they are both false. Either you must beware of him, or you must doubt your grandmother and me, for I tell you by the gift she gave me of testing hands that this man is a snake. That round body he shows is but the case of a serpent. Perhaps the creature lies there, as in its nest, coiled round and around inside. Horrible, said Irene, horrible indeed, but we must not try to get rid of horrible things. Oh, Curdie's answering, horrible indeed, but we must not try to get rid of horrible things by refusing to look at them and saying they are not there. Is not your beautiful father sleeping better since he had the wine? Yes. Does he always sleep better after having it? She reflected an instant. No, always worse, till tonight, she answered. Then remember, that was the wine I got him, not what the butler drew. Nothing that passes through any hand in the house except yours or mine must henceforth, till he is well, reach his majesty's lips. But how, dear Curdie, said the princess, almost crying. That we must contrive, answered Curdie. I know how to take care of the wine, but for his food, now we must think. He takes hardly any, said the princess, with a pathetic shake of her little hand, which Curdie had almost learned to look for. Oh, of her little head. He takes hardly any, said the princess, with a pathetic shake of her little head, which Curdie had almost learned to look for. The more need, he replied. There should be no poison in it. Irene shuddered. As soon as he has honest food, he will begin to grow better. And you must be just as careful with yourself, princess, Curdie went on, for you don't know when they may begin to poison you, too. There's no fear of me. Don't talk about me, said Irene. The good food, how are we to get it, Curdie? That is the whole question. I am thinking hard, answered Curdie. Let me see. Such servants as I saw below are sure to have the best of everything for themselves. I will go and see what I can find on their supper table. The chancellor sleeps in the house, and he and the master of the king's horse always have their supper together in a room off the great hall, to the right, as you go down the stairs, said Irene. I will go with you, but I dare not leave my father. I would go with you, but I dare not leave my father. I'm going to drink some water. Alas, he scarcely ever takes more than a mouthful. I can't think how he lives. and the very thing he would like, and often asks for, a bit of bread. I can hardly ever get for him. Dr. Kelman has forbidden it, and says it is nothing less than poison to him. Bread at least he shall have, said Curdie, and that, with the honest wine, will do as well as anything, I do believe. I will go at once and look for some, but I want you to see Lena first and know her, lest coming upon her by accident at any time you should be frightened. I should like much to see her, said the princess. Warning her not to be startled by her ugliness, he went to the door and called Lena, She entered, creeping with downcast head and dragging her tail over the floor behind her. Curdie watched the princess as the frightful creature came nearer and nearer. One shudder went from head to foot of her, and the next instant she stepped to meet her. Lena dropped flat on the floor and covered her face with her two big paws. It went to the heart of the princess. In a moment she was on her knees beside her, stroking her ugly head and patting her all over. Good dog, dear ugly dog, she said. Lena whimpered. I believe, said Curdie, from what your grandfather told me, that Lena is a woman, and that she was naughty but is growing good. Here's a picture of the princess kissing her face. Lena had lifted her head while Irene was caressing her. Now she dropped it again between her paws, but the princess took it in her hands and kissed the forehead betwixt the gold green eyes. Shall I take her with me or leave her? Asked Curdie. I'll leave her, poor dear, said Irene, and Curdie, knowing the way now, went without her. He took his way first to the room the princess had spoken of, and there also were the remains of supper, but neither there nor in the kitchen could he find a scrap of plain, wholesome-looking bread. So he returned and told her that as soon as it was light he would go into the city for some, and asked her for a handkerchief to tie it in. If he could not bring it himself, he would send it by Lena, who could keep out of sight better than he, and as soon as all was quiet as night, he would come to her again. He also asked her to tell the king that he was in the house. His hope lay in the fact that bakers everywhere got to work early, but it was yet much too early, so he persuaded the princess to lie down, promising to call her if the king should stir. Chapter 21. Oh good, I have time. His Majesty slept very quietly. The dawn had grown almost day, and still Curdie lingered, unwilling to disturb the princess. At last, however, he called her, and she was in the room in a moment. She had slept, she said, and felt quite fresh. Delighted to find her father still asleep, and so peacefully, she pushed her chair close to his bed and sat down with her hands in her lap. Curdie got his mattock from where he had hidden it behind a great mirror and went to the cellar, followed by Lena. They took some breakfast with them as they passed through the hall, and as soon as they had eaten it, went out the back way. At the mouth of the passage, Curdie seized the rope, drew himself up, pushed away the shutter, and entered the dungeon. Then he swung the end of the rope to Lena, and she caught it in her teeth. When her master said, "Now, Lena," she gave a great spring, and he ran away with the end of the rope as fast as ever he could, and such a spring had she made that by the time he had to bear her weight, she was within a few feet of the hole. The instant she got a paw through, she was all through. Apparently their enemies were waiting till hunger should have cowed them, for there was no sign of any attempt having been made to open the door. A blow or two of Curdie's mattock drove the shattered lock clean from it, and telling Lena to wait there till he came back and let no one in, he walked out into the silent street and drew the door behind him. He could hardly believe it was not yet a whole day since he had been thrown in there with his hands tied at his back. Down the town he went, walking in the middle of the street, that, if anyone saw him, he might see he was not afraid, and hesitate to rouse an attack on him. As to the dogs, ever since the death of their two companions, a shadow that looked like a mattock was enough to make them scamper. As soon as he reached the archway of the city gate, he turned to reconnoitre the baker's shop, and perceiving no sign of movement, waited there, watching for the first. After about an hour, the door opened, and the baker's man appeared with a pail in his hand. He went to a pump that stood in the street, and having filled his pail, returned with it into the shop. Curdie stole after him, found the door on the latch opened it very gently, peeped in, saw nobody, and entered. Remembering perfectly from what shelf the baker's wife had taken the loaf she said was the best, and seeing just one upon it, he seized it, laid the price of it on the counter, and sped softly out, and up the street, once more in the dungeon beside Lena. His first thought was to fasten up the door again, which would have been easy, so many iron fragments of all sorts and sizes lay about, but he was bethought himself that if he left it as it was, and they came to find him, they would conclude at once. My camera went off. They would conclude at once that he had made their escape by it, and would look no farther, so as to discover the whole. He therefore merely pushed the door close and left it. Then, once more carefully arranging the earth behind the shutter so that it should fall with it, he returned to the cellar, and now he had to convey the loaf to the princess. If he could venture to take it himself, well; if not, he would send Lena. He crept to the door of the servants' hall and found the sleepers beginning to stir. One said it was time to go to bed, another that he would go to the cellar instead and have a mug of wine to waken him up, while a third challenged a fourth to give him his revenge at some game or other. "Oh, hang your losses," answered his companion. "You shall soon pick up twice as much about the house, if you but keep your eyes open." Perceiving there would be risk in attempting to pass through, and reflecting that the porters in the great hall would probably be awake also, Curdie went back to the cellar, took Irene's handkerchief with the loaf in it, tied it round Lena's neck, and told her to take it to the princess. Using every shadow and every shelter, Lena slid through the servants, like a shapeless terror through a guilty mind. And so, but even though she didn't have one, by corridor and great hall, up the stair to the king's chamber. Irene trembled a little when she saw her glide soundless in across the silent dusk of the morning that filtered through the heavy drapery of the windows, but she recovered herself at once when she saw the bundle about her neck. She's so happy for her father. For it both assured her of Curdie's safety and gave her hope of her father's. She untied it with joy, and Lena stole away silent as she had come. Her joy was the greater that the king had woke up a little before and expressed a desire for food. Not that he felt exactly hungry, he said, and yet he wanted something, if only he might have a piece of nice fresh bread. Irene had no knife, but with eager hands she broke a great piece from the loaf. She broke the bread and poured out a full glass of wine. The king ate and drank, enjoyed the bread and the wine much, and instantly fell asleep again. It was hours before the lazy people brought their breakfast. When it came, Irene crumbled a little about, threw some into the fireplace, and managed to make the tray look just as usual. In the meantime, down below in the cellar, Curdie was laying in the hollow between the upper sides of the two of the great casks, the warmest place he could find. Lena was watching. She lay at his feet, across the two casks, and did her best to arrange her huge tail that it should be a warm coverlid for her master. By and by, Dr. Kelman called to see his patient, and now that Irene's eyes were open, she saw clearly enough that he was both annoyed and puzzled at finding His Majesty rather better. He pretended, however, to congratulate him, saying he believed he was quite fit to see the Lord Chamberlain. He wanted his signature to something important, only he must not strain his mind to understand it. Whatever it might be, if His Majesty did, he would not be answerable for the consequences. The king said he would see the Lord Chamberlain, and the doctor went. Then Irene gave him more bread and wine, and the king ate and drank and smiled a feeble smile, the first real one she had seen for many a day. He said he felt much better and would soon be able to take matters into his own hands again. He had a strange, miserable feeling, he said, that things were going terribly wrong, although he could not tell how. Then the princess told him that Curdie was come, and that at night, when all was quiet, for nobody in the palace must know, he would pay His Majesty a visit. Her great-grandmother had sent him, she said. The king looked strangely upon her, but the strange look passed into a smile, clearer than the first, and Irene's heart throbbed with delight. Okay, let me see how long this is, because I have a few more minutes. I think I can read it, because I really want to. All right, chapter 22. 22, right? The Lord Chamberlain. This was written in the 1800s. Look at how timeless it is for us. We're on chapter 22, all right. All right. At noon, the Lord Chamberlain appeared, with a long, low bow and paper in hand. He stepped softly into the room, greeting His Majesty with every appearance of the profoundest respect and congratulating him on the evident progress he had made. He declared himself sorry to trouble him, but there were certain papers, he said, which required his signature, and wherewith drew nearer to the king, who lay looking at him doubtfully. He was a lean, long, yellow man with a small head, bald over the top and tufted at the back about the ears. He had a very thin, prominent, hooked nose, and a quantity of loose skin under his chin, about the throat, which came craning up out of his neckcloth. His eyes were very small, sharp and glittering, and looked black as jet. He had hardly enough of a mouth to make a smile with. His left hand held the paper, and the long, skinny fingers of his right a pen just dipped in ink. We'll see what's on this. But the king, who for weeks had scarcely known what he did, was today so much himself as to be aware that he was not quite himself, and the moment he saw the paper he resolved that he would not sign without understanding and approving of it. He requested the Lord Chamberlain, therefore, to read it. His lordship commenced at once, but the difficulties he seemed to encounter and the fits of stammering that seized him roused the king's suspicion tenfold. He called the princess. "I trouble his lordship too much," he said to her. "You can read print well, my child. Let me hear how you can read writing. Take that paper from his lordship's hand and read it to me from the beginning to end, while my lord drinks a glass of my favorite wine and watches for your blunders." Now let's see who will drink it, because he thinks it's the other stuff, the other drink, "Pardon me, your majesty," said the Lord Chamberlain, with as much of a smile as he was able to extemporize, "but it were 1,000 pities to put the attainments of her Royal Highness to a test altogether too severe. Your Majesty can scarcely with justice expect the very organs of her speech to prove capable of compassing words so long and to her so unintelligible." "I think much of my little princess and her capabilities," returned the king, more and more aroused. "Pray, my lord, permit her to try." "Consider, your Majesty, that the thing would be altogether without precedent. It would be to make sport of statecraft," said the Lord Chamberlain. "Perhaps you are right, my lord," answered the king, with more meaning than he intended should be manifest, while to his growing joy he felt new life and power throbbing in heart and brain. "So this morning we shall read no farther. I am indeed ill able for business of such weight." "Will your Majesty please sign your royal name here?" said the Lord Chamberlain, preferring the request as a matter of course, and approaching with the feather end of the pen point to a spot where there was a great red seal. The seal of the king, right? "Not today, my lord," replied the king. "It is of the greatest importance, your Majesty," softly insisted the other. I descried no such importance in it," said the king. "Your Majesty heard but a part, and I can hear no more today. I trust your Majesty has ground enough, in a case of necessity like the present, to sign upon the representation of his loyal subject and chamberlain. Or shall I call the Lord Chancellor?" he added, rising. "There is no need. I have the very highest opinion of your judgment, my lord," answered the king. "That is, with respect to means, we might differ as to ends." The Lord Chamberlain made yet further attempts at persuasion, but they grew feebler and feebler, and he was at last compelled to retire without having gained his object. And well might his annoyance be keen, for that paper was the king's will, drawn upon by the Attorney General, nor until they had the king's signature to it was there much use in venturing further. But his worst sense of discomfiture arose from finding that the king was so much capacity left, for the doctor had pledged himself so to weaken his brain that he should be as a child in their hands, incapable of refusing anything requested of him. His lordship began to doubt the doctor's fidelity to the conspiracy. The princess was in high delight. She had not for weeks heard so many words, not to say words of such strength and reason from her father's lips. Day by day he had been growing weaker and more lethargic, like each of us can be when we get taken in by things of this world that are like these people but I won't say more. Let's just enter the story. Day by day, he had been growing weaker and more lethargic. He was so much exhausted, however, after this effort, that he asked for another piece of bread and more wine, and fell fast asleep the moment he had taken them. The Lord Chamberlain sent in a rage for Dr. Kelman. He came... Oh, I got dust on my book. He came, and while professing himself unable to understand the symptoms described by his lordship, yet pledged himself again that on the morrow the king should do whatever was required of him. The day went on. When his majesty was awake, the princess read to him one storybook after another. Like us, right? And whatever she read, the king listened as if he had never heard anything so good before, making out in it the wisest meanings. Every now and then he asked for a piece of bread and a little wine. Every time he ate and drank, he slept, and every time he woke, he seemed better than the last time. The princess bearing her part, the loaf was eaten up, the flagon emptied before night. The butler took the flagon away and brought it back filled to the brim. But both were thirsty as well as hungry when Curdie came again. Meantime, he and Lena, watching and walking alternately, had plenty of sleep. Watching and waking alternately, so they could each take a nap, had plenty of sleep. In the afternoon, peeping from the recess, they saw several of the servants enter hurriedly, one after another, draw wine, drink it, and steal out. But their business was to take care of the king, not of his cellar, and they let them drink. Also, when the butler came to fill the flagon, they restrained themselves, for the villain's fate was not yet ready for him. He looked terribly frightened, and had brought with him a large candle and a small terrier, a little dog, which latter indeed threatened to be troublesome, for he went roving and sniffing about until he came to the recess where they were. But as soon as he showed himself, Lena opened her jaws so wide and glared at him so horribly that without even uttering a whimper, he tucked his tail between his legs and ran to his master. He was drawing the wicked wine at that moment, and did not see him, else he would doubtless have run too. When supper time approached, Curdie took his place at the door into the servants' hall, but after a long hour's vain watch, he began to fear he should get nothing. There was so much idling about. Oh, 2 more pages or so. As well as coming and going, it was hard to bear, chiefly from the attractions of a splendid loaf, just fresh out of the oven, which he longed to secure for the king and princess. At length his chance did arrive. He pounced upon the loaf, carried it away, and soon after got hold of a pie. This time, however, both loaf and pie were missed. The cook was called. He declared that he had provided both. One of themselves, he said, must have carried them away for some friend outside the palace. Then a housemaid, who had not long been one of them, said she had seen someone like a page running in the direction of the cellar with something in his hands. Instantly all turned upon the pages, accusing them one after another. All denied, but nobody believed one of them. Where there is no truth, there can be no faith, To the cellar they all set out to look for the missing pie and loaf. Lena heard them coming, as well she might, for they were talking and quarreling loud, and gave her master warning. They snatched up everything, and got all signs of their presence out at the back door before the servants entered. When they found nothing, they all turned on the chambermaid and accused her not only of lying against the pages, but of having taken the things herself. Their language and behavior so disgusted Curdie, who could hear a great part of what passed, and he saw the danger of discovery now so much increased, that he began to devise how best at once to rid the palace of the whole pack of them. That, however, would be small gain, so long as the treacherous officers of state continued in it. They must be first dealt with. A thought came to him, and the longer he looked at it, the better he liked it. As soon as the servants were gone, quarreling and accusing all the way, they returned and finished their supper. Then Curdie, who had long been satisfied that Lena understood almost every word he said, communicated his plan to her, and he knew by the wagging of her tail and the flashing of her eyes that she comprehended it. Until they had the king safe through the worst part of the night, however, nothing could be done. They had now merely to go on waiting where they were till the household should be asleep. This waiting and waiting was much the hardest thing Curdie had to do in the whole affair. He took his mattock, and going again into the long passage, lighted a candle in, and proceeded to examine the rock on all sides. But this was not merely to pass the time. He had a reason for it. When he broke the stone in the street over which the baker fell, Its appearance led him to pocket a fragment for further examination, and since then he had satisfied himself that it was the kind of stone in which gold is found, and that the yellow particles in it were pure metal. If such stone existed here, in any plenty, he should make the king rich and independent of his ill-conditioned subjects. He was therefore now bent on examination of the rock, and nor had he been at it long before he was persuaded there were large quantities of gold in the half-crystalline white stone, with its veins of opaque white and of green, of which the rock, so far as he had been able to inspect it, seemed almost entirely to consist. Every piece he had broke was spotted with particles and little lumps of lovely greenish yellow, and that was gold. Hitherto he worked only in silver, but he had read and heard talk, and knew, therefore, about gold. As soon as he had got the king free of rogues and villains, he would have all the best and most honest miners, with his father at the head of them, to work this rock for the king. It was a great delight to him to use his mattock once more. The time went quickly, and when he left the passage to go to the king's chamber, he had already a good heap of fragments behind the broken door. Okay, the next chapter is chapter 23, of course, so we'll start back with that. Much love. Share, comment, like, do all of that. I ask of you, I invite you, because it grows my channel, and you know what I'm about. I'm about this. Much love.